Zoos are carefully designed to protect visitors from danger. Unfortunately, they can't protect these Karens from their own ego and stupidity. From a Karen who grabbed an elephant's trunk out of frustration to a Karen who forced her way into a glass booth she never paid for, only to pay a much steeper price. Hi, I'm Timothy, and this is Last Memories. It was July 11th, 2019. At a wildlife attraction near Branson, Missouri, visitors could purchase supervised encounters that brought them within a few feet of the park's elephants. By 10 that morning, temperatures had already climbed into the low 80s, and the park was busy. Ruth Ann Hartnett was 47 years old, a real estate agent from Springfield. 3 weeks earlier, she had purchased a premium elephant encounter ticket and wasn't entirely convinced she was getting her money's worth. 40 minutes before her scheduled encounter, Ruth Ann was standing at the front desk arguing that parking should have been included with the ticket. Not exactly the mindset you'd want before spending 15 minutes a few feet away from a 6-ton animal. Since Ruth Ann had paid specifically for an up-close elephant encounter, there was one important detail she needed to understand. The trunk is the most sensitive part of an elephant's body. It contains tens of thousands of muscles and serves as its primary sensory organ. Sudden contact tends to trigger an immediate reaction. The encounter lasted 15 minutes. The rules were straightforward. No sudden movements, no loud noises, no touching the elephant's face or trunk, and stay behind the yellow line. Ruth Ann interrupted the briefing twice, first to complain about the time limit, then to ask if she could feed the elephant herself. Kind of like asking a flight attendant whether the seatbelt sign is optional. Inside the enclosure, she crossed the boundary line twice within the first few minutes and was redirected each time. Around the 10-minute mark, the elephant turned toward a water trough. Ruth Ann moved to within about 4 feet of the animal without being instructed to approach. The elephant turned its head and released a brief nasal spray, perfectly normal behavior in warm weather. It splashed across Ruth Ann's face and shirt. She got furious. She reached out and shoved the elephant's trunk away. The elephant lifted its head and shifted its weight. The handler was already moving toward Ruth Ann and telling her to step back, but Ruth Ann was busy expressing her outrage over a dirty shirt. Unfortunately, the elephant had moved on to a different issue. The elephant's right foreleg came down onto Ruth Ann's left shoulder and upper chest, driving her into the concrete. Nearly all of the force was concentrated on the left side of her body. Her shoulder struck first, followed by her chest and arm, leaving her crumpled on the enclosure floor before the handler could reach her. Ruth Ann remained conscious after the impact, but was unable to speak. Her left arm was visibly deformed, and she appeared to be struggling to breathe. Approximately 4 minutes later, she lost consciousness. The handler radioed for help immediately. Park medics responded within minutes, followed by paramedics. Access to the enclosure was slowed by a series of secured animal management gates. Ruth Ann was transported to a regional medical center but never regained consciousness. Ruth Ann was pronounced dead later that day. A post-mortem examination found a fractured clavicle, 4 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and significant internal bleeding caused by severe blunt force compression to the chest. Investigators reviewed security footage, staff reports, radio logs, and the participant waiver Ruth Ann had signed before entering the encounter area. The waiver specifically prohibited contact with the elephant's trunk. The death was ruled accidental. The elephant encounter program was temporarily suspended before reopening with revised safety procedures and reduced group sizes. The lesson is, when there's an actual elephant in the room, focus on that first. The next one didn't involve an animal, just a woman who threw herself at the emergency door because an elderly stranger was getting off before her. It was October 3rd, 2014. Visitors to a wildlife park outside Asheville, North Carolina, could board a 2,000-foot aerial gondola that passed over animal exhibits before crossing a valley 72 feet above the ground. Each cabin held up to 6 passengers. Shauna Claire Denton was 55 years old. a retired office manager from Charlotte. She was visiting the park with her daughter and son-in-law to celebrate her birthday. Before they had even reached the gondola, Shauna had already found fault with the wait time, her coffee, and the seating near the large cat exhibit. Her cabin carried 4 other passengers, her daughter, her son-in-law, an elderly man traveling alone, and a couple in their 30s. They boarded at 1:43 in the afternoon, 8 minutes into the ride. Roughly 72 feet above the ground, the gondola's automatic brake engaged after a wind gust exceeded the operational threshold. The cabin came to a smooth stop. Within seconds, a staff member came over the intercom and explained that the brake had activated as a precaution. The cabin was secure, and ground crews were being positioned. Passengers were instructed to remain seated while evacuation preparations began, starting with the elderly passenger. Not ideal news, but also not the sort of announcement that normally requires anyone to do anything except stay put. Everyone stayed seated except Shauna. So much for the simple part. Her daughter told her to sit down. Shauna refused, insisting she wasn't going to wait in a stranded gondola while someone else was rescued first. She told staff she was claustrophobic, though her daughter later told investigators she had never mentioned that before. The staff member repeated the instruction to stay seated, but Shauna was already stepping toward the eastern door, climbing past the elderly passenger. The cabin began to sway. Her son-in-law grabbed her arm and tried to pull her back. Now 2 people were moving around the cabin, making the swinging worse. Shauna reached for the emergency release handle mounted beside the eastern door and pulled it despite repeated instructions not to touch it. The safety latch disengaged and the door swung outward with the cabin's movement. Her son-in-law managed to hold onto her arm for a moment, but her momentum carried her through the opening. She fell 72 feet onto the narrow maintenance path below. A camera mounted on a midline support tower captured the incident. Staff contacted emergency services at 1:58 in the afternoon, and ground crews reached Shauna within minutes. Emergency responders arrived shortly afterward, but Shauna was unresponsive when they reached her. She was pronounced dead at the scene at 2:31 in the afternoon. A post-mortem examination found fractures to the skull, cervical spine, and both legs, along with extensive internal injuries. The injuries were determined to be unsurvivable, with death occurring at or shortly after impact. Investigators reviewed tower camera footage, intercom recordings, and statements from the other passengers. The elderly passenger sustained a minor wrist injury during the cabin's movement. The death was classified as an accident. The gondola remained out of service for 2 months while safety modifications were completed, including additional safeguards around the emergency release system. What should have been one of the happier days of the year became the one her family would remember for all the wrong reasons. In Tennessee, a woman smuggled her dog past the entrance, watched it bark at a tiger enclosure, and thought it was funny until the tiger targeted her. It was August 14th, 2017. About 30 miles southeast of Nashville, a 60-acre safari park combined a traditional zoo experience with drive-through animal exhibits. Christy Buckner was 44 years old, a property manager from Murfreesboro. Rules, in Christy's view, were usually reasonable for other people. That morning, she arrived at the park with her husband and a 4-year-old Pomeranian tucked inside a canvas tote bag. The no pets policy was posted at the entrance, on the ticketing website, and at the bag check station. Christy brought the dog anyway. After all, what trouble could a tiny ball of fluff possibly cause at a tiger enclosure? We'd find out soon enough. Amur tigers are the largest tiger subspecies on Earth. Adult males can weigh more than 600 pounds, and they are highly responsive to the sort of high-pitched sounds small dogs tend to make when frightened. A staff member noticed movement inside Christy's bag near the tiger enclosure and asked if she was carrying an animal. Christy claimed it was her lunch and continued walking. Near the northeastern corner of the enclosure, she set the bag down and unzipped it. The dog immediately began barking. Her husband told her to pick it up and leave. Instead, Christy watched as an adult male tiger lifted its head from across the habitat and turned toward them. She laughed and told her husband to get his phone out. The tiger rose to its feet and stood motionless for several seconds, ears forward, eyes fixed on the bag. Then it started walking toward the fence in a straight line. To Christy, it looked interested. To the tiger, a small, frantic animal had just announced exactly where it was, which was about to become everybody's problem. The tiger crossed the enclosure in seconds and stopped at the inner barrier. What Christy didn't know was that a previous repair at the corner post had left the outer fence bowing slightly outward, narrowing the gap between the two barriers at that specific point. The issue had been documented in a maintenance report, but a permanent repair had not yet been completed. Christy was crouched beside the bag with the right side of her face and shoulder near the fence when the tiger extended a forepaw through the gap. One swipe was all it took. The impact knocked her backward immediately. Deep lacerations tore across the right side of her face, neck, and shoulder, and she collapsed onto the ground before she seemed to fully understand what had happened. Her husband caught part of her weight as she fell. The dog bolted and was recovered by a bystander a short distance away. Christy was still conscious after the strike, but blood loss was immediate and severe. Emergency services were called at 10:48 in the morning and arrived 16 minutes later. She was transported to a trauma center and taken into surgery, but died that afternoon at 1:32. A post-mortem examination found deep lacerations to the right side of Christy's face, neck, and shoulder, with multiple major blood vessels severed in a single strike. Investigators reviewed witness statements, photographs, and available security footage. A later inspection confirmed the fence irregularity at the corner post, which was repaired within 45 days. The death was determined to be accidental, and no further action was taken. In the end, the only part of the story that didn't behave as expected wasn't the dog or the tiger. It was Christy. Meanwhile, in Arizona, this woman's kids got escorted out of a closed desert exhibit in 104-degree heat, and she refused to follow because she wasn't done arguing. It was July 22, 2018. Extreme heat had forced the closure of a desert reptile exhibit at a wildlife park outside Tucson, Arizona, earlier that morning. Patriciana Beverly was 41 years old, a stay-at-home mother from Scottsdale. She liked things organized, efficient, and preferably on her timetable. That morning, she arrived at the park with her 2 children and had already ignored a couple of restricted access points because they offered a more convenient route. When she reached the desert reptile exhibit at around 11:15 and found it closed, she saw the rope barrier, saw the crowd building at the adjacent exhibit, and made her choice. Apparently, whatever was on the other side of that rope couldn't have been more inconvenient than waiting in line. She told her kids to follow her and walked through the unlatched entrance gate. A staff member noticed them enter and came over immediately. He explained that the exhibit had been closed due to extreme heat and that conditions inside were unsafe. Patriciana nodded, said she only needed 10 minutes and continued deeper into the exhibit. Realizing he wasn't going to change her mind, the staff member escorted the 2 children back out, telling them their mother would be right behind them. Patriciana continued through the exhibit alone. Staff checked on her several times as she moved through the area. At first, she responded. Eventually, she stopped responding. Let's pause for a second here. She let her own kids wait outside so she could keep wandering through an exhibit. That is quite a choice. After some time, a staff member went in to bring Patriciana back out. The plan was simple: locate her, walk her back to the entrance, and reunite her with her children. Instead, they found her collapsed before they ever reached her. She was on the ground about 120 feet from the entrance. Her skin was hot, dry, and deeply flushed, a sign that her body had largely stopped cooling itself. The enclosed structure had trapped enough heat to reach 111 degrees Fahrenheit while she was inside. Staff immediately began cooling her and called for emergency assistance. Her body was already failing from extreme heat exposure. Her internal temperature had climbed beyond the point where normal cooling mechanisms could keep up, placing her organs under severe stress. The park's location within the city meant a short response time. Emergency responders arrived at 11:54 and reached the exhibit at 12:02. Doctors continued aggressive cooling and supportive treatment at the hospital, but Patriciana was pronounced dead at 2:48 in the afternoon. A post-mortem examination recorded Patriciana's core body temperature at 107.2 degrees Fahrenheit when emergency responders reached her, well beyond the point at which the body can effectively cool itself. The extreme heat triggered multi-organ failure. Investigators concluded that the enclosed exhibit had created conditions far more dangerous than the outdoor temperature and estimated that Patriciana had remained inside for roughly 25 to 30 minutes before collapsing. Evidence included staff radio logs, the interior thermometer reading, and statements from park employees. The death was ruled accidental. The saddest part is that, to her children, this was supposed to be a quick stop at the reptile exhibit. Down in Florida, a woman at a roadside animal park thought waving the handler out of her photo was a reasonable thing to do with a 14-foot python around her neck. It was June 2nd, 2015. Visitors filled the outdoor pavilion of a roadside animal park outside Ocala, Florida, for the afternoon reptile show. Maria Catherine Laurel was 39 years old, a salon owner from Gainesville. She had a habit of treating expert advice as a starting point for negotiation. That afternoon, she arrived with 4 friends for a snake photo experience and quickly made it clear that she wasn't worried about the python. In fact, she seemed more interested in showing off than listening to the briefing. Burmese pythons are constrictors. Once they begin wrapping, movement and pressure can trigger them to tighten their grip. For that reason, handlers remain within arm's reach of a participant's upper body at all times. The photo experience was supervised by a lead handler and an assistant. Before each session, participants were given the same instructions: stand still, avoid sudden movements, do not reposition the snake, and keep the handlers close. Maria Catherine was directing the shoot within 30 seconds of the snake being placed on her shoulders. Turning left, turning right, calling out to her friends about angles and lighting. The lead handler told her twice to face forward and stay still. She did briefly, then resumed. Then she decided he was ruining the photos. She waved him back, saying he's in every shot and he should step out of the frame. He told her he needed to maintain contact. She waved him back again, told him it looked like a promotional photo for the park. No, it didn't, and the handler wasn't photobombing anything. He was doing his job. He took one step back. His contact with the snake dropped to a fingertip at the edge of his reach. The snake's tongue flicked and made contact with the left side of her face near her ear. She flinched. Her head snapped to the side and her shoulder came up with it. The anterior coils tightened immediately. The lead moved back toward her within 2 seconds, but the snake had already shifted, its head moving from her right shoulder toward the back of her neck. Maria Catherine grabbed at the coils with both hands, twisting and pulling. Each movement drew the coil tighter. Within just a few seconds, it had reached her neck. The lead handler couldn't get a clean grip. Every time he worked his fingers toward the coil, Catherine's movements shifted the snake's position. The assistant joined in immediately, but once the python had wrapped around her neck, neither handler could safely pull it free without risking further tightening. Together, they began working the python loose from the tail end forward, the safest way to uncoil a fully engaged constrictor. By the time the coil around her neck was removed, Catherine had been on the ground for more than a minute. She was conscious but disoriented and struggling to breathe. Staff tried to keep her still as they called for emergency assistance. Responders arrived at 2:35 and transported Catherine to the hospital immediately. She died later that afternoon from a hypoxic brain injury caused by compression of the airway and carotid vessels. A post-mortem examination estimated that loss of consciousness would have occurred within 60 to 75 seconds of full coil engagement at the neck. Cell phone video recorded by 2 of Catherine's friends captured much of the incident and was later reviewed by investigators. The footage aligned with statements provided by both handlers. Investigators ultimately determined that the death was accidental. For someone who liked calling the shots, Maria Catherine chose the wrong situation to take control of. From Florida to Ohio, a woman who didn't pay for a behind-the-scenes tour decided she was being cheated out of the best parts and walked through the wrong door to prove it. It was September 13, 2014. 12 visitors had signed up for a behind-the-scenes tour at a zoo outside Columbus, Ohio, giving them access to several restricted staff areas. The tour began at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Winifred Cranston was 46 years old, an insurance adjuster from Columbus. Paying for the tour apparently seemed optional to her. She slipped through the staff access gate behind the last participant and explained that her ticket wasn't showing up on her phone. That explanation would have been more convincing if she had actually bought one. The tour was detailed and slow-moving. Winifred had expected animals. Instead, she found herself walking through hallways, storage areas, and staff corridors. By the time the group reached the large carnivore management area, she had checked out completely. At around 2:38, while the group gathered around a feed preparation station, Winifred slipped away into a nearby service hallway. About 40 feet down, she found a door propped open with a rubber wedge. Earlier, the guide had explained that some areas were off-limits for safety reasons. She still went in. The room was a sanitation storage area lined with shelves of cleaning chemicals and maintenance supplies. A staff member had stepped out only minutes earlier after combining a chlorine-based disinfectant with another cleaning agent, creating unusually concentrated fumes inside the poorly ventilated room. Lying about the ticket was one thing. Wandering off into a restricted room suggested Winifred was beginning to mistake access for permission. Winifred wandered farther inside, unaware that unusually dangerous chemical fumes were already building in the enclosed room. At first, the irritation would have seemed minor. By the time it became obvious something was wrong, the exposure had already become dangerous. A few minutes later, she started coughing. The coughing became relentless, and breathing grew noticeably harder. She turned toward the door but struggled to stay on her feet. Reaching for the central shelving unit, she knocked over the bucket and collapsed beside it. Back in the main corridor, the tour had moved on to the veterinary observation area. The guide had done a head count at the entrance, standard procedure before the ticket check, and come up one short. She retraced the route with a staff member, calling out as they went. The maintenance worker returned to the hallway at around 2:47. He heard coughing from inside the room, followed by a loud impact and then silence. When he pushed the door open, he found Winifred unconscious on the floor. He dragged her into the hallway, opened the door fully, and radioed for emergency assistance at 2:48. Responders arrived within minutes. Winifred was unconscious and breathing shallowly when they reached her. She was transported to the hospital with supplemental oxygen, but died later that afternoon from acute chlorine fume inhalation. A post-mortem examination found severe fluid accumulation in the lungs caused by concentrated chemical exposure. Investigators concluded that the partially enclosed room, open cleaning solution, and limited ventilation had created dangerous conditions within minutes. Evidence included radio logs, staff statements, tour records, and ticketing records confirming that Winifred had never purchased a behind-the-scenes tour ticket. The incident was ultimately classified as an accidental death. For all the effort Winifred put into getting access, the place that ultimately defined her story was never meant to be part of the tour. Just down in Florida, a gust of wind took this woman's cash into an alligator enclosure, and she went in after it without thinking twice. It was July 9th, 2016. Summer visitors crowded the outdoor exhibits of a zoo outside Tallahassee, Florida. Near the park's eastern boundary was a large alligator habitat centered around a freshwater lagoon. Mariette Granger was 52 years old, a real estate broker from Tallahassee. She had a habit of treating rules as suggestions and staff as obstacles. That morning, she arrived with her sister and 2 teenage nephews and had already argued about a bottled water price and complained about the park's no outside food policy despite showing up with a cooler full of food. For someone upset about the cost of a bottle of water, Mariette had arrived remarkably well supplied. American alligators are ambush predators. They spend most of their time motionless near the water's edge and can cover surprising distances in a fraction of a second when they strike. Once they secure a grip, a death roll can cause devastating injuries very quickly. Warning signs lined the perimeter fence, and a staff member repeatedly reminded visitors not to approach the water or reach through the barrier. Mariette spent several minutes near the eastern fence line. She had already been told more than once to step back from it. She complied both times, but not without making it clear she found the whole thing ridiculous. It's astonishing how quickly Mariette turned a day at the zoo into a series of arguments, which were pretty pointless, by the way. At around 2:15, Mariette took out some cash while arguing with her sister over money. A gust of wind carried 3 bills over the fence and onto the lagoon, only a few feet from the water's edge. The staff member monitoring the habitat had stepped away moments earlier. Mariette grabbed the top of the chain-link fence and leaned over the barrier, reaching for the bills. Her fingertips were inches away. The water beside her shifted. An 11-foot alligator had been lying motionless near the fence line, almost completely hidden beneath the dark surface. The animal lunged and clamped onto her right forearm just below the elbow. The force pulled her forward. Her grip slipped from the fence and she went into the water. The death roll began almost immediately. For several seconds, the surface churned violently before settling again, but she never resurfaced. The staff member who had stepped away heard the screaming and returned to the fence line within moments. Emergency services were contacted at 2:19, but a specialized animal response team was required before anyone could safely enter the water. Mariette was recovered from the lagoon at 2:47, about 8 feet from the fence line. A post-mortem examination determined that she drowned after suffering catastrophic injuries during the attack. The examiner documented traumatic amputation of the right forearm and extensive injuries to the right shoulder and upper chest, consistent with a death roll. The injuries would likely have left her unable to stay conscious or keep her airway clear, leading to drowning shortly afterward. Evidence recovered included statements from 4 visitors, the on-duty staff member and his colleague at the habitat entrance, partial security footage from the entrance camera covering the eastern fence line, and the bills recovered from the lagoon surface during the post-incident water assessment. The death was ruled accidental. Mariette comes across as someone who expected the world to make room for her. An alligator enclosure was never going to do that. For the last story, a heavy-set woman got herself trapped inside a viewing booth she hadn't paid to access, where the sealed glass cooked her in direct sunlight. It was May 21, 2019. A zoo in Baltimore, Maryland offered visitors access to enclosed viewing booths overlooking its African savanna exhibit. The booths were designed for 1 person at a time and had a posted weight limit. Odette Lily Stinson was 58 years old, a retired school principal from Baltimore. She had spent decades making decisions and wasn't especially interested in being told no. That morning, she arrived with standard admission and made it clear she had no intention of paying $12 for 10 minutes in a glass booth. Odette had the kind of determination that can be either admirable or deeply problematic depending on the circumstances. This was very much the second kind. She found the elevated walkway later that morning and spent nearly 15 minutes watching the booth entrance. She wasn't admiring the view. She was watching the process. Who went in, who came out, and how the staff member managed the line. When a visitor exited at around 11:40, Odette was already moving. She stepped past the queue, informed the staff member she had been waiting longer than anyone else, and complained about the upgrade fee. When he told her she needed to pay, she walked into the booth and pulled the door shut behind her. The staff member followed immediately and told her to come back out. She ignored him. With her body pressed tightly against the inward opening door from the inside, he couldn't pull it open and radioed for a supervisor at 11:42. Inside the booth, a different problem was developing. The space had been designed for a single average-sized adult. Odette had managed to squeeze in by turning sideways, but once inside, her hips and torso became wedged between the side panels and the inward opening door. When she tried to back out, she couldn't create enough room to turn or free herself. She was stuck. What made the situation dangerous wasn't just the size of the booth. It had been sitting in direct sunlight for hours. Temperatures inside could climb far above the outdoor temperature, turning the enclosed space into something closer to an oven than a viewing area. Odette began calling out at 11:44, saying she was too hot and couldn't breathe. Her voice carried through the glass, but by then her body was wedged directly behind the inward opening door, preventing staff from opening it more than a few inches without forcing it into her. A supervisor arrived at 11:51, but even together they couldn't create enough space. Maintenance was called to remove the door from its hinges. Maintenance arrived at 11:58 and removed the door at 12:04. Odette was unresponsive. Emergency responders reached the walkway minutes later, but attempts to revive her were unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead at 12:35 that afternoon. A post-mortem examination found that Odette died from respiratory failure caused by extreme heat exposure and physical restriction inside the booth. Investigators noted that her inability to move normally accelerated her decline. Maintenance staff recorded an internal temperature of 117 degrees Fahrenheit after the door was opened. The medical examiner classified the death as an accident. In the end, the trait that carried Odette through much of her life may have been the same one that trapped her inside that booth.